Telemachus. On January 1st, 404 CE, a Christian monk from the east made his way through the crowded streets of Rome. The city was celebrating the new year with the traditional gladiatorial games, drawing thousands to the Colosseum. Telemachus had journeyed far, driven by his faith and a growing conviction that the blood sport was an abomination before God. The arena that day was hosting a sin missione match, a fight without mercy, where one combatant certainly die. Two professional gladiators faced each other, their weapons glinting in the winter sun. The crowd roared with anticipation as the men began their lethal dance. Witnesses later described how Telemachus suddenly appeared. He raised his hands, calling for the combat to end in the name of Christ. For a moment, everything stopped. The gladiators, surprised by the intrusion, lowered their weapons. The silence didn't last. A murmur of confusion turned to anger. The spectators had paid to see blood, and this monk was interfering with their entertainment. Someone threw a stone. It struck Telemachus on the shoulder. Then another hit his back, and another his head. "Stop this murder!" he shouted, but his words were drowned by the growing chorus of rage. More stones rained down as he stood his ground. The gladiators stepped back as the crowd took over their role. Blood streamed down Telemachus' face as rocks continued to strike from all directions. He fell to his knees, still praying. His body crumpled under the barrage, but witnesses reported he remained conscious in every impact. Some in the crowd tried to intervene, but they were pushed back. The stoning continued until Telemachus lay motionless on the sand, his monk's robe soaked red. When officials finally reached him, he had stopped breathing. His death would later convince Emperor Honorius to ban gladiatorial combat forever. Crixus. In the spring of 72 BCE, the escaped gladiator Crixus led a force of nearly 30,000 rebel slaves through the Italian countryside. He was a Gaul by birth, once forced to fight in the arena for Roman entertainment before joining Spartacus in a revolt that shook the Republic. Unlike his ally who aimed to escape Italy altogether, Crixus hungered for vengeance against Rome. This desire for retribution led him to separate from the main rebel army. With about 1/3 of their forces, mostly fellow Gauls and Germans, he turned south toward the fertile lands of Apulia. His warriors raided farms and villas, leaving destruction in their wake, but Roman spies tracked their movements closely. The Senate had dispatched the experienced commander Quintus Arrius to hunt down the breakaway rebel force. On a clear morning near Mount Garganus, Roman legions appeared suddenly on 3 sides of the rebel camp. Professional soldiers in tight formation, they outnumbered Crixus' fighters and held the high ground. Despite the disadvantage, Crixus chose to fight. Witnesses later told how he personally led the charge against the Roman center. For a moment, the rebel attack seemed to break through. Then the hidden Roman cavalry struck from behind. Trapped between infantry and horsemen, the rebel lines collapsed. Crixus fought on as his men fell around him. A Roman pilum spear pierced his thigh, slowing his movements. Still, he killed 2 legionaries who approached. The fatal blow came from a Roman officer. A sword thrust caught Crixus beneath his raised arm, sliding between his ribs and into his lung. He dropped to his knees, struggling for breath as blood filled his chest. The officer finished him with a second thrust to the throat. Crixus died watching his remaining fighters being slaughtered. His severed head was later delivered to the Senate as proof of victory. The Arbellas. In 42 CE, during Emperor Caligula's reign, a rare type of gladiator known as an arbalest stepped into the arena outside Rome. These fighters were a variation of the retiarius, carrying a curved blade along with the traditional net and trident. This particular arbelest was a man in his 30s, recently transferred from games in Sicily, where his performances had been mediocre but acceptable. The Emperor Caligula himself was in attendance that day, seated in the imperial box, draped with purple silks. He had been drinking heavily since morning, his mood growing increasingly volatile as the day progressed. The crowd of 20,000 spectators fell silent as the emperor's presence was announced. When the arbelest entered to face a heavily armored Murmillo, his movements lacked energy. Instead of the aggressive opening stance expected, he hung back, circling cautiously. The crowd began to murmur with disappointment. Twice he threw his net and missed. His third attempt entangled only the Murmillo's shield arm, a minor advantage he failed to press. From the imperial box, Caligula's displeasure became increasingly obvious. He stood shouting obscenities that echoed across the sand. The arbelest, distracted by the emperor's rage, missed a simple parry and received a gash to his shoulder. Though not severe, the wound seemed to drain what little fight remained in him. "Coward!" Caligula screamed, his face flushed crimson. "Take him out! Take this dog out now!" The Praetorian guards moved immediately. 4 of them entered the arena, dragging the stunned arbelest away while the fight was still underway. He struggled briefly, then went limp as he realized what was happening. The Murmillo remained in place, eyes downcast, as his opponent was pulled from the sand. Behind the arena walls, the arbelest began screaming. The guards held him down while another approached with a Pugio dagger. The blade plunged into his stomach, then his chest, then his throat. His screams became wet gurgles as blood filled his lung. 17 stab wounds later, the guards dragged his corpse back out and dumped it in the center of the arena as Caligula applauded. Ignatius of Antioch. In 107 CE, elderly Christian bishop Ignatius was led in chains into the Flavian amphitheater in Rome. The 70-year-old religious leader had been arrested in Syria and transported across the Mediterranean specifically for public execution. Emperor Trajan had ordered this spectacle to demonstrate Rome's power over the growing Christian sect. For months, Ignatius had traveled under guard, writing letters to Christian communities along the way. In these letters, he expressed not fear, but anticipation of his martyrdom. "I am God's wheat," he wrote, "and I shall be ground by the teeth of wild beasts." Now that metaphor would become literal. The arena had been prepared with minimal scenery, just sand and a post where condemned prisoners could be tied. But Ignatius would face his death unbound. The summer heat had drawn nearly 50,000 spectators, many curious to see how this Christian leader would face death. Would he recant? Would he plead for mercy? As he was pushed into the center of the arena, Ignatius remained composed. A herald read the charges against him, refusing to worship the emperor, spreading foreign superstition, undermining Roman values. The crowd jeered, but some fell silent, impressed by the old man's dignity. Beneath the arena floor, handlers prepared the lions. These animals had been starved for 3 days to ensure maximum aggression. At the signal, iron gates creaked open. 2 male Barbary lions emerged, their manes darkened with sweat in the heat. Ignatius knelt in prayer as the predators approached cautiously. The first lion circled once, then lunged. Its massive jaws clamped Ignatius' shoulder, tearing through flesh and breaking bone. The bishop's scream echoed briefly before the second lion attacked his legs. The cats worked methodically, pulling the old man apart while he remained conscious. Blood soaked into the sand as Ignatius' prayers turned to gasping breaths. Witnesses reported his eyes remained fixed on the sky, even as the lions tore into his abdomen, spilling his intestines onto the arena floor. The crowd watched in silence as the lions until nothing recognizable remained of the man who had once led Christians in Antioch. The Appian Way. In 71 BCE, the Third Servile War came to its brutal conclusion. The slave rebellion led by Spartacus had been crushed by the forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus near the Sale River. Though Spartacus died in battle, thousands of his followers were captured alive. Crassus, determined to send a message that would echo through generations, ordered an unprecedented punishment. Along the Appian Way, Rome's most traveled road stretching from the capital to Brundisium, Roman soldiers prepared for a mass execution. At regular intervals of approximately 30 meters, they erected wooden crosses. 6,000 crosses in total, creating a grotesque forest of wood that would soon bear human fruit. The captured rebels, already weakened by battle and a week without proper food, were marched to these sites. Each man was forced to carry the beam of his own cross. Many collapsed along the way and were dragged the remaining distance. The crucifixion process began at dawn. First, the victims were stripped naked, adding humiliation to their torment. Their arms were stretched along the crossbeam and secured with either rope or nails driven through the wrists. Historical accounts differ on the method used for this mass execution, but evidence suggests both techniques were employed. The crossbeam with the prisoner attached was then hoisted onto the vertical post. The feet were positioned one over the other and secured with a single nail through both heels, or tied with rope to prolong the suffering. Unlike most executions, these men received no mercy stroke, no breaking of the legs to hasten death. Crassus wanted them to linger as long as possible. The physics of crucifixion ensured their suffering was excruciating. Each breath required them to push up on their wounded feet, scraping their raw backs against rough wood. The summer heat brought additional torture as dehydration set in. Some survived for days, their skin blistering under the sun, lips cracking from thirst. Witnesses described the road as transforming from a path of screams to moans to eerie silence as death gradually claimed the rebels, one by one. The Trident Skull. During the 2nd century CE, in the coastal city of Ephesus, a gladiatorial combat took place that would be preserved in bone for nearly 2 millennia. The match featured a retiarius, a lightly armored fighter equipped with a net, trident, and dagger, facing off against a heavily armored opponent. Spectators filled the stadium that afternoon, eager to witness the classic contest between speed and power. The retiarius was a veteran of perhaps a dozen fights, his body marked with the scars of previous encounters. His opponent that day was a secutor, a gladiator specifically trained to counter the retiarius style. The secutor wore a smooth helmet with minimal eye holes to prevent the trident from finding purchase, and carried a large rectangular shield. As the fight began, the retiarius circled warily, his bare feet silent in the sand. The crowd watched as he made several feints with his net, attempting to gauge his opponent's reactions. The secutor advanced steadily, shield raised, breathing heavily in her heat. Minutes passed as the fighters tested each other. The retiarius threw his net twice without success. On the third attempt, something changed. The weighted edge of the net caught the rim of the secutor's shield, pulling it slightly off center. In that fraction of a second, the retiarius lunged forward. The trident, a weapon with 3 prongs each measuring 20 centimeters in length, was thrust with precision and terrible force. It struck the side of the secutor's helmet where the metal was thinnest, near the temple. 2 prongs scraped across the bronze, but the central tine punched through with a sound that witnesses later described as a dull crack. The secutor staggered, but remained standing. Blood began to flow from the helmet's eye holes. The retiarius, sensing his advantage, yanked the trident back and struck again. This time all 3 prongs penetrated the skull. The tines drove through the temporal bone and deep into the brain. The secutor convulsed, his limbs jerking uncontrollably as the trident was withdrawn. He collapsed face first into the sand, blood pooling around his head. The match was over, but the evidence of this kill would remain preserved in bone, discovered centuries later by archaeologists excavating the Gladiator cemetery of Ephesus. The hammer execution. Throughout the imperial period, beneath the grand arches of the Ephesus amphitheater, there existed chambers the public never saw. These back rooms served as preparation areas for gladiators before they entered the arena, and as processing rooms for those who would not return to their barracks. It was here that one of the most clinical aspects of the games took place. On a sweltering afternoon in the 3rd century CE, a Thracian-style gladiator staggered from the sand, supported by 2 arena attendants. The fighter had received a deep sword wound to his abdomen during combat. Though the crowd had spared his life by turning their thumbs, the reality was different. The wound was mortal, and everyone present knew it. The Thracian was conscious as they dragged him through the dimly lit corridor. Blood spilled from his wound, leaving a trail on the stone floor. In the preparation chamber, a man waited. He was not a medicus or healer, but an executor, a specialized attendant whose job ensured no gladiator suffered unnecessarily when death was certain. The wounded fighter was placed face down on a wooden table. His helmet had been removed in the arena, exposing his shaved head. The executor approached without ceremony, carrying his tool of mercy, a hammer with a square head measuring approximately 5 centimeters across. The Thracian's breathing came in ragged gasps. He knew what was coming. Some wounded men fought this final moment, but he remained still. Perhaps he appreciated the quicker end than the slow death his wound promised. The executor positioned himself at the head of the table. With practiced precision, he placed the hammer against the left temple of the gladiator. No words were exchanged. The executor swung the hammer with controlled force, not to crush the skull entirely, but to drive a precise, fatal blow. The square head punched through bone with a sharp crack. The Thracian's body tensed once, then went completely limp. Blood and cerebrospinal fluid leaked from the perfectly square hole in his skull. His suffering had ended in seconds rather than hours. Archaeological evidence of this practice was discovered in the Ephesus Gladiator Cemetery, where numerous skulls bear the distinctive square-shaped puncture wound, the signature of the hammer executor's efficient work.